Hello and a very warm welcome to you. Benga is is caught in the midst of so many stories making headlines in the African continent. Once again, you're welcome to another edition of The Conversation on News Central TV. And on this program, we get to discuss political stories, look at the political architecture on the African continent. And on Monday and Wednesday, we discussed the highlights of 2021. We also looked at elections and transitions. And today we're also looking at elections and transitions. And we know that there are supposed to be elections in some African countries. We have Kenya, we have Somalia, we also have Senegal, yes.
And Libya.
Yeah. We also have Libya. And recently we know that President Emerson Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe has also fixed a date for March 26th for the by-election for legislative and municipal elections, yes.
And also, it's instructive to note that Senegal will be having municipal elections in this calendar year 2022. So we look forward to a lot of politicking in the year. Today concludes our elections and transition series.
Definitely.
But it's nice to mention some news headlines that...
Yes, and also making headlines. We know that in Nigeria, that's in the northeast. Unfortunately, we had quite a sad story making headlines today. And those were the killings of about 60 people in Zamfara State. And Benga, you would know that yesterday, the federal government actually declared these bandits as terrorists. So it's quite shocking, don't you think?
Yes, it is. And sad to mention that in Burkina Faso too, there were terrorist attacks. And the politics also determines the type of leaders you elect. And their primary responsibility is to provide security for their people.
Of course, this will be major talking points. Benga is also looking at securing the continent. So we'll also be discussing that subsequently on News Central TV. And now looking at today's edition, we know that over the last 12 months, Africa's democratic trajectory has been extremely volatile, ranging from protests in Eswatini, Swaziland, demanding an end to the country's absolute monarchy, a peaceful turnover of power in Zambia, and a military coup in Sudan that undercut the country's fragile political transition.
In 2022, developments in 4 countries, Angola, Kenya, Libya and Somalia, will provide an important bellwether for where the continent is heading. All 4 countries face important local and national elections. The outcome of these elections will significantly impact prospects for reversing democratic erosion, the extent to which society and countervailing institutions can keep leaders accountable, and the future range of tactics that incumbents employ to retain power. On the conversation today, we will conclude our series on elections and projections for the continent.
And we have our guest with us, Aliyah Valles, a security analyst at Castovilla, and Ernest Ansah Lati. He is the program head of Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center, Accra, Ghana. It's so good to have you join us on News Central TV. Right now, we have with us, of course, joining us later on will be Ernest Ansah Lati. But right now, we have Aliyah Valles, a security analyst. It's so good to have you join us on the conversation at this time.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to our conversation today.
Definitely.
Great. Now let's begin the conversation from Kenya, where last month opposition leader Raila Odinga launched his 5th bid for the presidency. However, the ongoing soap opera amongst political elites in the run-up to the country's August 9, 2022 general elections has been unfolding for several years. In 2018, President Uhuru Kenyatta's Jubilee Party reconciled with Odinga via a symbolic handshake over the intensely heated 2017 electoral contest. William Ruto and Raila Odinga, who were allies in 2007 elections, are now separately mobilizing monetary and electoral support for the campaigns. Aliyah, my question to you is this. While democratic elections are usually promising, Kenya has developed a firmly established pattern of electoral violence since the advent of multi-party elections in Kenya. Do you think that there seems to be a palpable tension in the air in Kenya as we inch towards the general elections in August? Do you think Kenya's past of electoral violence is over, or what's the mood like in the country?
I think that's a very interesting and really prevalent question, across all the countries really that we're talking about today, from Angola to Somalia and Libya. I think the general trend is political instability and real questions around security in all of these countries. Whether it's a long build-up, as you said, a history of violence, especially around periods of election and democratic change or political change rather, or whether it's just generally countries having really severe and deep security concerns. And I think it's it's really at the forefront of the minds of the electorate, which is what I believe we should be focusing on, because a lot of, Kenya has also, much like many of these other countries, has had a history of political spats, between various leaders, various political factions. But I think what's important to focus on is that we've got a really strong electorate in Kenya, much like other African countries, that is willing and wanting to vote and and allow the democratic process to continue. And I think beyond that force, we've also got Western powers that have actively voiced their concern over these particular security concerns, and the fact that a democratic process, a free and fair electoral process, is necessary for any kind of change in these particular African countries. So I think the mood in Kenya right now is that the electoral process needs to continue. It needs to happen in a very timely fashion in order for any kind of change to happen in Kenya.
While most residents are hoping for a free and fair election, we know that apart from electoral violence, we also know vote buying is a big problem in Kenya, like most African countries. So how best can we curb the issue of vote buying?
I'm sure there are multiple policy kind of recommendations on this very relevant question, but I think it really comes from, I think this question can only be addressed by asking the electorate themselves, because it is them who are being targeted. It is them who, ultimately have a lot of power in their hands within the electoral process. But I think, in my opinion, it comes down to really strong institutions and strong policies, strong bodies which respect the democratic process, which are willing and able, fully equipped, to see the democratic process through, in order for, issues like buy-in and various other kind of issues which really threaten the democratic process and democracy continent-wide in Africa. Institutions and strong policies that can really curb these types of obstacles, because it's really there where we start to see meaningful change at an institutional and systemic level take place. So, for example, whether it comes to implementing a constitution, whether it comes to election observers, which the United Nations has sent to places like Somalia, like Libya, constantly reporting on the situation on the ground, and whether the electorate's voice is really being heard is really effective, in my opinion, in measuring what better we can do as as Africans, from a continental level to more specific at a micro country level.
Okay, let's look deep into politics now, political emotions. We know of the President Uhuru Kenyatta and, of course, a major ally of his, Raila Odinga. Let's talk about this symbolic handshake which they had that brought about the BBI, which was supposed to be a Building Bridges initiative. But if we look at the prospects of the BBI, it gave so many things that would negate democracy, talking about power sharing between the president and prime minister, appointing a regulator to oversee the judiciary. So can we say that the BBI ruling, of which the court rejected, was a big development for judicial independence in Kenya?
100%. I think so. I think it's a really firm stance by the judiciary as well in strengthening its own institutional capacity on Kenya's democratic landscape. And I think it also gives kind of the electorate and other politicians a kind of sign to say that we have working institutions. There's certain things that can't be should no longer be considered obstacles to having free and fair democracy, but also the working relationship of leaders is particularly highlighted in this moment, to say that public image of cooperation, of strengthening the judiciary or the legislature or the executive, these types of institutions, sends a very clear message to the electorate to say that our democracy is at work, our leaders are at work. I think it gives somewhat of a kind of public face to Kenya's democracy that's much needed in a time where the country really is facing much political instability, but also very real insecurity across the country.
Earlier, staying in Kenya, Kenyan presidential elections have typically always bowled out to a two-horse race, but this time around, you have a lot of heavyweights. You have Mr. Kituyi. He left his plush job in Switzerland. He was the immediate past Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. You also have two former vice presidents in Musalia Mudavadi and also Kalonzo Musyoka. Let's not forget the others in the race. So are we likely to see a two-horse race between William Ruto and Raila Odinga? We do understand that William Ruto is currently in a rift with his president, Uhuru Kenyatta. Will that change the political dynamics and as we inch towards these elections?
I think it's a very relevant question. As you said, this country has a history of truly coming down to a two-horse race, and I think that the fact that there are other contenders, other willing and ready and fully equipped contenders with their own kind of support groups, should not be taken lightly. I think it's a good sign for Kenya's democratic landscape to say that that there are more than one. There's more than one horse you can back really as a member of the electorate. And it's a really good show for Kenya's democracy being vibrant. I also, as a South African who's very familiar with the concept of coalitions, I believe that if it does come down to it, I think that coalitions could be something Kenya's democracy could become familiar with. We could see real challenges from opposing parties kind of coming together and making a really strong play against the ruling party. And I think it makes an even better kind of political landscape where you've got a variety of choices, the electorate.
Now, Aliyah, talking about coalitions, in the last general elections, there was the One Kenya Alliance where you had all these heavyweights. They had gentlemanly agreements, and at the end of the elections, everyone fell apart. Some people didn't keep to their own part of the agreement. So it's quite difficult now that, everybody can be a president on their own. So do you see these heavyweights not learning from the past and going into a coalition only to be cheated out or falling into disagreement?
That's a very difficult question, and we've certainly seen a history of coalitions or people rather backing away or backing out of gentlemanly agreements around post-election time when those agreements are being made. And I think there's really no surefire way of telling, but I do think that we're in for a really interesting ride, let's say, in Kenya, because I think there are a lot of voices on the table and a lot of kind of power players making real strong plays at changing policy, changing the way things are done, that may not suit everybody. And I think, again, I'll return to the point. I think the real kind of power lies with the electorate, and I think we'll see that come out strong and clear once the votes are counted.
But from what we've seen so far, we know that there's a bit of voter apathy when you look at voter registration. Do you really think, because most people say Kenya's election is characterized with electoral violence, vote buying, as we earlier discussed, so most of the residents are more like, why do we have to go through all this again when at the end the big powers will still come to play? So do you still see voter apathy in this year's election?
Just to add to what Rita said, a lot of people are confident in the Electoral Commission being independent and doing a great job.
And I think that's a problem we're seeing in a lot of African countries is voter apathy and just general kind of obstacles to get voters to the polls. You know, whether it be electoral violence or threats or kind of general disinterest. And I think that's something that, you know, as much as it may not, as much as it kind of curbs people like me who are enthusiastic about the power of the electorate, I think it the statistics post kind of elections speak for themselves whether it comes to voter apathy, and the consequences are felt, you know, far beyond simply not going to the polls. They definitely come out in whether policies are changed, whether institutions are strengthened, whether leaders are kept in power. And I think that, you know, the Kenyan kind of population, if change does not come through elections, I am for sure, just like many African countries, I'm sure the people will have their say in another way. You know, whether it comes to demonstrations, whether it comes to, any kind of active expression from civil society in a way that, because Kenya, for example, it's got a number of problems, you know, much like any other African country. And I think that at some point the electorate has to voice itself in one way or another. And like I said, you know, whether it is through democracy, through the kind of democratic process that is in itself, you know, flawed in that particular country because of things like electoral violence. It will come out, the voice of the electorate will come out. And I think, again, I will return to the point of Western pressure and even pressure from other African countries around the fact that, you know, if you are a democracy in Africa, you're expected to be a functioning one, meaning you must have free and fair elections. Democratic electoral violence, is a thing that should be should be in the past in this continent. And I believe we can work towards that.
Okay. I'd like to bring in Ernest Lartey here. He's in Accra, Ghana. Hello, Ernest.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, Ernest. We're just discussing the political situation in Kenya. My question to you is this, Ernest. We see a lot of politics in Africa that discusses, it's mostly tribal. You see a lot of tribal kingpins. And money is always a big factor when it comes to elections. In Africa, you would think 60 years post-independence, Africa should have moved beyond discussing these issues of providing roads and light, Maslow hierarchy of needs, to more serious developmental issues. Why do we seem to be caught up in this conundrum?
Well, thank you very much. Our democracy, if I may say, is still at the infant child level. What it means is that we have started the experiment, and therefore we are bound to face these challenges of tribalism and then monetization of our electoral process. It will take some time before we are able to overcome this. In terms of democracy and development, you notice that countries that have remained stable and have started consolidating their democracy over time, early 1990s. So, for instance, say Ghana, say Senegal, and Nigeria maybe, and a few other countries, you'll notice that even though we still have monetization of the electoral process and ethnicity, which plays a very major role, yet because of the relative stability that we have across those countries, there's some kind of development taking place. We've seen roads being constructed. We've seen hospitals being built. We've seen the economy also becoming stable. Even though we still have challenges like what COVID has come to destabilize a lot of these countries. So we would have to do this experiment over a long time before we begin to see the dividends of democracy manifesting. So it doesn't matter we are talking about Kenya or Libya or any other country, we need to begin to have stability first. And so once there's conflict, once there's instability in those countries, then definitely, and those instability and conflicts are fueled by ethnicity and corruption and many other things. So the root causes are the major things that we need to deal with. And once we are able to overcome it, then we'll be able to move on the path of development, which I'm afraid is not going to be easy for most African countries to deal with.
Thank you, Ernest. Rita, I like what Ernest said, that it has to take time. Democracy takes time to evolve. Rome wasn't built in a day. If Rome was built in a day, we would have hired the same contractors to come help us fix Africa.
So definitely we're progressing so far, Gbenga. But Aliyah, Ernest, Gbenga, let's move on now to Angola. And the country's presidential polls will see incumbent João Manuel Lourenço of the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola seek a second term after he took over in 2017 from José Eduardo dos Santos, who had been in power for nearly 4 decades. Lourenço faces opposition from a new coalition, that is, the United Patriotic Front. Now, according to reports, the opposition has the wind in its sails, while the MPLA is more divided than ever. Angola's political and governance direction could be determined by the quality of this electoral process. Now, I'll stay with you, Ernest. We're seeing a strong opposition coming up in Angola, but we know that incumbent President João Lourenço pledged to be the man of the Angolan economic miracle in 2017. If you remember the campaigns he talked about, he brought so much promises of ending corruption, diversifying the economy in Angola, but we still know that Angola is still faced with myriads of economic and social problems, even in his first term. So how do you think he can address these problems? Or rather, how well do you think he has addressed it?
Well, Angola is an interesting country in which, currently, as I have mentioned, they also have issues of corruption, and most of these political actors have been implicated, especially the former president and the daughter, who was also implicated in a lot of these oil and use and many other things. And what one can still imagine from Angola is that we will still see the instability caused by the elements affiliated to ISIS, so wanting to disturb the process, even though there's that determination to have the election run. What is happening is what we have seen across the region, that we are not too much interested in having a free and fair election, but we are more interested in having a peaceful election. And so once we are able to have elections that are peaceful, there could be some spots of violence here and there, but once it is peaceful, let's forget about how transparent or credible the elections are.
Thank you very much, Ernest. I'd like to bring in Aliyah here. João Lourenço, a.k.a. J-Lo, as is affectionately called in Angola, created a rift to make his mark by declaring a war on corruption, nepotism, and impunity. This crusade ended up with former strongmen of the Dos Santos clan falling into disgrace, even leading high-ranking members of the ruling MPLA, civil servants, ministers, party officials, and even members of the presidential family, including José Filomeno dos Santos' son. They were brought to justice. His daughter, the former head of Sonangol, Angola's oil company, was also removed. Is Lourenço using his anti-corruption fight to settle political scores? And do you think this will be his undoing, because you have disgruntled elements in the ruling MPLA, or it's the people's will that matters at the end of the day?
I think these anti-corruption measures that you have mentioned, whether it's high-profile corruption cases, to the fact that Lourenço's granted media, super long interviews, allowed demonstrations by the civil public, and communicated openly about his political stances on social media, are all really kind of different elements he brings to a presidency, as opposed to Dos Santos's legacy and the way he ruled Angola. And I think it really differentiates him from a kind of product of a political system and a political party, because it's a clear stance against rooting out various levels of systemic corruption in the MPLA. But I won't go so far as to say that it's too optimistic, because as you mentioned, this new coalition, the United Patriotic Front, poses a real challenge. Its slogan is "Those eager for change," and I think the key emphasis here is change. Is that the ruling party that is it's celebrating 65 years this year, or last year. The fact that people want change, and the fact that you've got a real kind of coalition of contenders for that change, shows that perhaps those efforts by Lourenço aren't enough for the electorate at the moment, aren't enough perhaps even for his own party. As you mentioned, the disgruntlement from members of his own party is a real battle, in an election year, because you've got to keep your ducks in a row. But I think, coming off of the celebration of those 65 years, I think his party is firmly behind him. I don't think that they have, for example, an alternate candidate. I think Lourenço is their firm push for a second electoral term, and I think, to be very honest, I think he's got enough kind of manpower behind him.
So you do not feel he is witch hunting the opposition?
I think he's responding to a really strong call for anti-corruption measures that were being heralded throughout the Dos Santos presidency. As you mentioned, it was 30 years of strong claims of corruption, of strong corruption that has been evidenced in recent years. So I don't think it's a necessary witch hunt. I think he's responding to very popular calls, not only in his electorate but in factions of his own party and of the current government. So I can understand why it seems like that, especially given that these high-profile corruption cases have been kind of centralized in a particular family, the Dos Santos family. But no, I think he's responding to larger calls. I don't think it is necessarily as political as a manhunt or a witch hunt.
While so many factors are differentiating Lourenço because he came up with so many electoral campaigns, we know of this controversial electoral bill in September 2021 requiring that counting of votes be done centrally and not municipal counting. So don't you think that this invalidates a lot of the electoral process we're going to see in Angola?
And leaves room for corruption?
Of course, and I think it was a very bold political move on his part. I think any kind of and we've seen it across African countries, any kind of tampering with the kind of template democratic process raises a lot of eyebrows, raises a lot of questions with regards to how free and fair or how sound the electoral process is. Especially, when it comes to vote counting and centralizing processes, it definitely opens up doors for whether it is corruption of any kind, or simply just altering the democratic process. So yes, I think I can't tell you what the kind of results are going to be from that process, but I think that regardless, if for example Lourenço wins, I think the United Patriotic Front will definitely contest the elections, or at least put up some kind of good fight with regards to the results of the election. So I don't think you can alter democratic process without any kind of consequences from the electorate itself or from your opposition.
Thank you, Aliyah. Just before we go on a quick break, I'd like to bring in Ernest here. Ernest, the ruling MPLA has given assurances that the elections will be democratic, free and fair. We do know the MPLA has been in government for the past 38 years and more, yes. So do you share in this optimism of the ruling party saying, these elections will go about without incident, and they'll be free and fair, because like we saw in Zambia last year, the ruling party lost elections and it passed without incident.
Yes, we are beginning to see a certain trend emerging across the region, in which you have had elections that were held. The opposition defeated it. It went to court, and then the judiciary passed, in which the judiciary. Hello. In which
I can go on, please. We can hear you.
Yes, in which the judiciary has played a key role. So increasingly, you notice that the judiciary is also playing a major role in our electoral process. Hitherto, that was not the case. People would just opt for violence. Now, we need to strengthen the role of the judiciary to be able to be independent enough to adjudicate on electoral disputes. With this, as you have cited the case of Zambia and maybe Malawi and others, if we begin to have trust in the judiciary, then of course, whoever loses the election, whether it doesn't matter how you lose the election, once the court has pronounced on it, we all go by what the court has said. But that also brings in another challenge, which is that the Electoral Commission or the election management bodies, in most of the constitutions that we have, are the only body that should be able to declare on elections. But now that we are having the judiciary trying to also overturn declarations by the Electoral Commission, then we need to go into our constitutions to make certain corrections, because it means that the Electoral Commission is not the final, does not have the final say when it comes to electoral matters. Yes, and therefore, as far as I'm concerned, for Angola, what it means for all of us is that once we have had that promise that whoever loses the election will go by the results, it's a good news for all of us, and let us hope that that prevails when the elections are held.
Thank you very much, Ernest. You're watching The Conversation on News Central Television. We'll go on a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue with our top stories. We're looking at elections and transitions in 2022. We'll be looking at the elections in Libya and Sudan. You stay with us. You're welcome back to The Conversation here on News Central Television. We still have Aliyah Vaez of Castro Valley and Ernest Ancelate with us on The Conversation.
And now turning our attention to Libya, on December 21, 2021, 2 days before Libyans were supposed to elect a president who could finally unify the country behind a single leader, Libya's election commission effectively postponed the vote. Now, violence suddenly seemed imminent in Tripoli, the capital city, and non-government militias used sandbags and pickup trucks with machine guns mounted on them to create roadblocks. Colleges and universities were shut down in anticipation of trouble, and the United Nations warned the country risked losing a chance to end the conflict that has ravaged the country since the uprising against Muammar al-Gaddafi in 2011.
الموضوع اللي صاير ما نعرفش لمتى بتتأجل الانتخابات هذه بعد 24 ديسمبر هذه لمتى اسبوع اسبوعين عام قاعده مش معروفه الامور قاعده مش واضحه بشكل عام.
نتمنى لا ترجع الحرب، نتمنى الحرب ما تاتي الا بالدمار والخراب والتهجير، فنتمنى الا ترجع الحرب.
خيبه الامل هذه وارده على كل ليبي، كانت فرحه ان احنا يوم 24 يعني يطلع لينا نموذج إنسان جديد ينقذ البلاد ويعطينا شيء من عنده، وفرحانين بالانتخابات هذا. نبوا يوم 24 لكن تو يعني تأجلت، يعني في مشكلة كبيرة.
So the first in that kind of order of priority is that Libya's elections between last year and now the process, the procedure, and the conditions have not been met for free and fair elections. The first is that there is a constitutional absence for these elections. There is no definition of the powers of what president may come and what kind of power he may wield, for how long, and what his relationship to the institutions of state will look like. And then finally, the security situation has been generally eroding, but it has kind of been transformed with the return of Saif al-Islam Gaddafi after a 10-year absence, establishing a third center of power, a third center of gravity in the south of the country that has really kind of changed the way in which many of the local military factions had been engaging one another as the two sole rival factions, but also now to accommodate this third faction, it's created new fissures, it's created new frictions, but it's also created opportunities for political pragmatism. And
the immediate risk for Libya with these botched elections is to plunge again into a new moment of political turmoil and political crisis. We are at a moment where there is a risk of having the appointment of a new interim government that is contested by rival factions in other parts of the country. We are facing the possibility of just elections being postponed indefinitely and a return to these split administrations in the country. Does this mean actually a return to war? That's another question.
That's another question. Would we return to war due to this postponement? I mean, a lot of people were anticipating for this election.
You could see the disappointment on the faces of ordinary Libyans because they wanted a new lease of life. The past 10 years have been tumultuous and they were looking forward to a new lease of life. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. Why didn't it happen is one of the things we would get from our panel of experts.
Definitely. And though it was a disappointment to many, some observers believe that rather than offering a solution to Libya's problems, an election might have simply compounded them. I don't know how that will happen.
We'll get to that. I also share in those thoughts and sentiments.
But if you look at it, there were so many issues on the elections. We talk about election laws, of course, legibility of the candidates, powers between the future president and parliament. They were some of the contending issues. So I guess Aliyah and Ernest, I'll start with Aliyah. What exactly were your thoughts on the postponement of the elections? Does this mean a return to war?
I think that's a very relevant question, given the fact that there are still, armed groups stationed all over Tripoli right now. Because I think the country's on edge. They're waiting for the next announcement. And I think, as you both mentioned, it really was a knock to the country's morale and hope for a democratic process that really was supposed to, be this kind of symbol for transformative change for the country's social, economic, and political conditions. However, I think the multitude of obstacles listed by the kind of electoral commission in Libya about the legislative obstacles, the fact that a list of candidates for the presidency wasn't finalized, 2 days before an election. There was no kind of tangible way an election could have happened. However, I think as much as you definitely as you mentioned, Benga, that you could see the disappointment on members of the public's faces, I can't gloss over the fact that the list of candidates at the moment, included Gaddafi's son, who is currently, has war crimes outstanding against him by the International Crime Commission. As well as General Haftar, who was part of the very siege of Tripoli, not too long ago. So I think that as much as the democratic process was a sign of hope, I must share your sentiments in terms of the fact that there's. I wouldn't know what kind of results it would glean. However, I do recognize the fact that multiple Western countries, including the UK, France, Germany, the US, and Italy, have voiced their concern over the fact that an election must take place and a date must be set, simply because the country is committed to this and this UN-led peace process. An election is at the forefront of this, which is what the country needs.
I'm happy you mentioned international partners of Libya, and that brings me to this question. There was an image that just rolled on our screen now of a Libyan carrying a placard, and it read, "The people decide, not foreign diplomats." Do you think the international community is putting the cart before the horse? Because the conditions on the ground do not necessarily make for elections to hold. There's an absence of a constitution or even an agreement from the basic political principles needed to create one. And all of these conditions pose a threat to a meaningful democratic elections.
I think it's a fair, fair placard, especially for a country and an electorate that's been waiting so long for an election that means so much, as we've discussed, to the average Libyan. However, I think, in recognition of the kind of incident that happened with the UK's ambassador to Libya, involving a tweet that kind of affirmed the UK's support for the kind of interim government at the moment to continue their duties until an election is held. I think it was, I can see how it was easily considered an overstep, where it's not a foreign power's position to interfere in any way, let alone comment on the fact that on a potential electoral process or an interim government. I don't think necessarily the UK's intentions were to do so. I think it was simply trying to kind of support the fact that the country should get to an electoral an election point, my bad. But I think that the pressure by these foreign powers, as we've mentioned, plays a significant role in putting not necessarily the electorate, like the average Libyan, but the kind of powers that be, that interim government that we've been talking about, under immense pressure, because these aren't necessarily only just foreign powers, they're economic powers as well. And I think they hold a lot of sway in determining the economic future of Libya, and which is inevitably tied to its political future as well. So I think, I can see how it's an overstep to the average, person who is going to cast their vote in Libya, when that date comes. Mm-hmm. However, I do think the kind of pressure being put on by these foreign powers has a very important role to play in pushing those kind of decision makers to the polls.
I would still like to have Enes's view on this. What do you think has been the impact of foreign influences in Libya? We know that Libya is split between several eastern powers. So let's have your take on this.
Yeah, so the thing about Libya is that, for me, there are three key stakeholders we have to take into consideration when it comes to any political or electoral processes, and Libya is not an exception. The first is the electorate themselves. Is the population ready for election? This is a country that has not seen peace in the last decade or so. And without peace, do you think that we have the conditions necessary for elections to take place? Maybe the population thinks that whatever it says that they are going to vote for will not count in the first place. Are they willing to go out and register and have a credible roster that will be prepared for elections to be run? And will they come out in their numbers to vote in the midst of the insecurity that we see in Libya? So that is number one. The second has to do with the candidates. Do we really think that these actors who we see as political candidates have really transformed from the warlord position to a truly civil political position in which one can have confidence that we are making a transition from war to peace and for democracy to take place? And as far as I'm concerned, some of these political actors are also affiliated to some of the armed groups that we have, who are causing the instability in the country. So the second level is still not yet ready. Yeah. Second is the election management body, and I think the point has been already articulated by my co-panelists. So I need not to overemphasize. The international community will only come to support the process. In fact, they are not supposed to even interfere. But it's because we are dealing with a state that is already collapsed, even though we have an interim government, so to speak, in place. But you notice that nothing is actually functioning in the country. So why do we want to post elections on a country that is not prepared for it? So let's begin to focus on the security situation. How do we embark on security sector reform to be able to transform all these armed groups into a formal professional security service for the country? When we have been able to do that, then of course we begin to talk about elections in Libya. I'm afraid it's very, very little that the international community will do no matter what.
And as you've made so many valid points, you talked about the candidates, talked about the electorate being ready, even the electoral body who is supposed to conduct the elections being ready for this election. So despite the fact that Libya's election has been postponed, are things in place? Do we have candidates who will lead us to authoritarianism? We have a warlord like
divisive candidates, Baber, Khalifa Haftar, and Saif al-Islam.
Gaddafi, yes, that was a son of the late Gaddafi. So there's so many things on ground for Libya, and our fingers are crossed. But away from Libya, let's look at Somalia, where we have growing pressures, disputes between the president and the Prime Minister, Mohamed Roble. Let's take a look at this footage and we'll be right back.
wuxuu go'aansaday inuu asagu intuu talada ku qabto qaab dimuqraadi ah inuu u bedelo dictatorship oo markaas oo golihii shacbigana oo shaqadii ka cadilay oo gudoomiyay oo ka qaaday oo dastuurka oo ku shaqeyneen oo markaa isku dayo inuu isticmaalo xoog ciidan oo qaawan dastuurka Soomaaliya oo ku meel gaarka ah ra'iisul wasaaraha waxa kalsoonida kala laaban kara golaha shacbiga sidaas oo kale madaxweynuhu markuu magacaabo ra'iisul wasaaraha oo magacaabo madaxweynaha ra'iisul wasaaraha waxa kalsooni iyo golaha shacbiga marka dastuurkan kuma qorra kumana taalo meel uu madaxweyne ra'iisul wasaaraha shaqada ka joojin karo
waxaan rabaa in shacabka Soomaaliyeed la wadaago in talaabooyinkii uu qaaday madaxweynihii hore Maxamed Cabdullaahi Farmaajo ay yihiin isku day bareer ah oo lagu afgaminayo dawladnimada dastuurka iyo sharciyada dalka u taala Farmaajo ka sokow inuu
Now, in those footages you saw there, even though not in English language, but yes, they were still making valid points. We saw the president accusing the prime minister, I guess, of going beyond his mandate. And of course, we also saw the prime minister now accusing the president of trying to subdue the nation's democracy and, of course, the constitution. So we have different points there from the president and the prime minister. And then, unfortunately, on December 27, 2021, after all the disputes going on with the prime minister and the president, we saw the president suspend the prime minister. And that's where we take our positions
and the
from.
prime minister said the suspension is unconstitutional and he doesn't, it will take no effect.
So we're looking at this now, looking at the issue between the prime minister and the president. How do we see things brewing up in Somalia? I'll come to you, Aliyah.
I think this is a really interesting, kind of situation to watch and to observe, where you have a president and a prime minister really accusing one another of being threats to the electoral process. And also, the prime minister accused the president of derailing the entire, Somalia's entire democracy. And I think, it has only caused division and even factionalism within the ruling government at the moment. And I think it's really testing kind of the limits of not only the democratic process to have these two kind of this tussle within government, but also the electorate, because who do you even go to for guidance when the prime minister is contradicting the president's orders, and the prime minister also has come out on national television saying he's calling all national defense forces to come under his command. That is a huge security threat to the country. And on top of the fact that the electoral process in Somalia is pretty complex compared to other countries, you've also, the country is facing constant insecurity by Al-Shabaab in several areas where it still maintains control, where you still see occasional attacks and threats to civilian security. And you can see it, I'll mention it again, it's really straining the country's ties with its Western allies who are quite impatient for a smooth electoral process process to happen in Somalia. You know, the U.S. was a prominent voice in this group of Western allies who came out and said it's really deeply concerned over the continuous delays and procedural irregularities of Somalia's democratic process. Nevertheless, it's putting pressure on the country to come to the polls.
I don't want us to forget the fact that Mohamed tenure has actually expired since February 2021.
Now, I'd like to bring in Ernest here before we begin to wrap things up. Somalia is very important in the region for geopolitics and also security. We understand what's going on with Al-Shabaab there. There's a saying in Africa that when two elephants clash, it's the grass that suffers, and the grass here is a metaphor for the ordinary Somalis who are tired of all this drama. My question to you, Ernest, is can international development partners, the EU, the African Union, and Somalia's neighbors, and even the United Kingdom exert some form of force to get these two warring factions down to the negotiating table so Somalia can have elections and move on? Because we do know how things are so fragile. The security situation in the Horn of Africa region, they're still dealing with the situation in Ethiopia with the Tigray. Or are international development partners just tired of, is there some form of conflict fatigue? Because they're dealing with COVID, there's a war in Ethiopia, and the Libyan situation is also there.
You're right. The idea about the international community or the development partners, as I've already mentioned, their role is to facilitate. But we know that in some occasions, they actually try to give direction as to how things should move. The African Union mission, AMISOM, has been there for quite some time, trying to provide security, and now efforts have been made to ensure that Somalia has built its own security to be able to take care of their affairs. And so we saw a gradual drawdown of the AMISOM troops. But you notice that the more we see the drawdown of the AMISOM troops, the more the militants, Al-Shabaab militants, gain ground. And so the local forces that have been trained, you keep asking the question, because a lot of resources, as you have mentioned, have been devoted into the training, recruiting of Somali security. The point, though, is that the training, the recruitment, and most of these measures that were taken through the security sector reform process that will help Somalia to retain its own security were done outside Somalia. So, for instance, Kenya was one of the countries that opened its doors for these recruitment exercises to take place. And so the context has not been the same. And when they go back to the home country, they face a rather very challenging situation, because that was not where the process actually started in terms of the recruitment, the training, and everything. So the training and the equipping has been a problem, especially the equipping the forces has been a major thing, because when you train the forces and you deploy them and they do not have the necessary tools, highly sophisticated tools to be able to, especially those that have intelligence components into it. If you train and they don't have intelligence to be able to detect activities of Al-Shabaab will always be ahead of these new trainees. And so a lot has been done by the international partners, no doubt about it. But I think that the citizens themselves must begin to show commitment to take ownership of all the peaceful processes that the international community have supported them with. So that, for instance, we noticed that the elections were even scheduled some years back, I think 4 years ago or so, and it kick-started with the constitutional review process. And they were adopting the constitution in Parliament. But at some point in time, the process stalled, and because of that, we've not been able to have a smooth transition to having elections that would now open the opportunity for effective political process to take place and have a smooth march to peace. And so, in terms of the role that the international partners have played, I think it's been very significant. My main point is that we need to begin to equip.
And as you always make so much valid points, you talked about the influence of the international forces, and we could go on and on about the intricacies on the political stories in the African continent. But unfortunately, we must thank you, Aliyah Vyas, Castro Valley, and Ernest Ansah Lartey, for lending your voices to issues on the continent. We do hope to bring it subsequently on the program. Thank you so much, Ernest and Aliyah.
It's a fine place to leave the conversation today, and I'd like to say a very big thank you to our resource persons, Leah and Ernest. We thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah,
and, look forward to having you next time. Until next time, on The Conversation, I'm Benga Aboroa.
And I am Rita Omodia.